when I was digging into ESG, and I was trying to figure out like what does this mean? Like how can they do this? And I happened to stumble across this after January 6th. And I remembered that story about Bank of America turning over all the records of people that were shopping in DC the day of January 6th, and the feds using that information to go after people. And I was like, hold on. So as you're purchasing things, the bank is taking records of it and then handing those records over to the feds so the feds can make decisions about whether or not you are capable of being an investor or being, and if you're making the right purchases in the right area. What if you're investing in cryptocurrency? What are they going to do to you then? What if you're investing in, Smith and Wesson? What are they going to do to you then? So I started seeing this immediately, that I was like, this is bad news. And you mentioned social credit scores, and people, I think, conflate to a degree ESG and social credit scores. I think there's a difference. Can you explain a little bit about that?
All right. So I actually, the best way I've heard this articulated is that you can think of ESG as a kind of a social credit score for corporations, and it will function at that level so that investors will be directed away from investing funds in certain corporations. So what we're looking at is a system for controlling the corporatocracy that can be modeled or it could eventually be directly applied to individual citizens. So let's go back up a little and set the table. ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance standards. And this is a metric for measuring how good your corporate social responsibility is. There's been iterations of it and it's been forwarded by different groups over the decades, but the ESG term itself was coined in 2005 by the UN Global Compact. What's the UN Global Compact? Well, let's take it from the bastion of truthiness, Wikipedia. There you go. United Nations Global Compact is a non-binding United Nations pact to encourage businesses and firms worldwide to adopt sustainable and socially responsible policies and to report their implementation. Blah, blah, blah. Areas of human rights, labor, environment, anti-corruption, da, da, da. Anyway, in 2005, they had a report called the Who Cares Wins Conference. And that report was, at least as far as I can tell, where this term ESG was coined and first forwarded. It took a while for it to catch on, though. And it's really in the last couple of years that the idea of assigning ESG scores, okay, let's rank. How good is this company doing on our standards for what it needs to do for its environmental responsibility, its social responsibility, its corporate governance, and then coming up with a score in which you can grade and rank different corporations. And if you don't happen to meet a certain threshold, you don't invest in them. Because if you, as an institutional investor, go in and invest in a company with a low ESG score, that's going to lower your ESG score, and then you'll get less funding and people will be less willing to work with you. So it's essentially sort of this, hey, it's a voluntary system. It's non-binding. This isn't a government regulatory system. So and there's nothing ethically wrong with it, right? But move ahead to 2014. And there's this fascinating piece from NPR, of all places, that again, it's an open conspiracy. There's nothing hidden about it, but you can go and read their piece from 2014, World's Richest People Muse on How to Spread the Wealth. And it's literally illustrated. This article is illustrated with a photo of Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, Prince Charles, and the Christine Lagarde, then of the IMF, at this conference that they were holding back in 2014 on inclusive capitalism. So they held this conference in London, and there were about 250 people at this event. And these 250 people represented $30 trillion in investable capital, which was estimated that at that time as roughly 1/3 of the total investable wealth in the world. We're meeting in this one room in 2014 to talk about this concept of inclusive capitalism. So what does that mean, though? Like, what does that actually mean, inclusive capitalism? And even this article goes on to admit the phrase inclusive capitalism is deliberately broad. People talked about it as valuing long-term investment over short-term profits. Some mentioned environmental stewardship. Others focused on treating workers well. Christine Lagarde, who runs the International Monetary Fund, said it is a way to rebuild trust in the financial system. And ultimately, of course, again, it means whatever they want it to mean. It sounds good, though. Inclusive capitalism, you couldn't get more buzzwordy than that. But that's, I think, the framework in which we start to see this headlong rush into the creation of an ESG metric that somehow assigns a number, a score for you on this scale. How much are you in the club of this inclusive capitalism, or whatever we're calling it this week? How much can we trust that you're on board with our agenda? And so all of the power really lies in whoever's writing the metric itself. Do you think every single investor in every single company that's going to be looking at investing assets, especially for these big institutional investors, are going to be looking at that ESG score and thinking about how was that score calculated and what went into that? And but why did you rank them that way? No, they're just going to be looking at a number, and it's going to tell them, okay, green light or no, red light, and very little else. And so the real question then is the creation of universal ESG accounting standards that essentially the whole world will adopt. Again, no binding treaty or anything. It's just, everyone's doing this, so I guess we'll do it now. And this was specifically talked about in the Harvard Business Review just last month. We need universal ESG accounting standards, where they note that there are this incredible universe of acronyms that are working on this question right now. The CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, the GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative, the IIRC, the International Integrated Reporting Council, the SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board. And apparently the one that seems to be the front runner right now for the one that could develop some sort of truly global ESG rating is the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. But you can go into, for example, the CFA Institute, which is the board or the group that certifies the CFA chartered accountant CFA rating, are working on global ESG disclosure standards for investment products. Oh, guess who else is working on an ESG standard? The WEF, the World Economic Forum. Oh. Their IBC, International Business Council, has created a Measuring Stakeholder Capitalism WEF IBC Common Metrics document, which furthers their Measuring Stakeholder Capitalism document from September 2020, which is trying to form this sort of overall picture, not just ESG, but incorporating ESG as well as corporations' adherence to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and again, coming up with numbers. So you can see something of a war developing between different bodies that want to control the standard so that they can say, if you do this, you get a good mark. If you do this, you get a bad mark. And they get to certify the people who do this type of metric reporting. At any rate, let's go back to George Carlin. It's the big club and you ain't in it. And That's what this is about. And they are going to set some sort of global standards for corporate behavior. And the creepiest aspect of this that I've seen in recent weeks that really solidified in my mind, this is exactly what this is about, was this long interview in Politico with Fiona Hill talking about Russia and Ukraine and what's happening there. And towards the very end, they were talking about the response to this needs to be bigger than NATO. Bigger than NATO? Well, not militarily bigger than NATO, but in terms of corporations. Corporations have a responsibility to not be dealing with Russia right now. And so the interviewer was saying, well, how do you do that? I mean, some companies might decide not to. And she brought it back to ESG. This has to be part of ESG. We have to downgrade people who are going to be working with rogue regimes like Russia or something along those lines. Again, this entire global standard is evolving completely out of the realm of any sort of governmental situation. And this is not something that's going to be gavelled down by law, but it's just going to be this standard that the 250 people or so that control 1/3 of the world's investable assets are going to decide, okay, we'll use this. And now we get to literally dictate what way the world goes. A prime example of that, the 2021 shareholder letter from Larry Fink of BlackRock was all about ESG and how this is the way forward and we have to be on board with this and blah, blah, blah. Of course, BlackRock, one of the handful of institutional investors that controls however many billions of dollars, trillions of dollars. I can't remember what it is, 10 trillion or whatever it is in and of itself. Yeah. These are the places at which the rubber meets the road in terms of the formation of this overall system. So I think of it as a corporate social credit system that, again, can be used as a model for what will ultimately be imposed on citizens somewhere down the road. Because again, that's based on the old thinking of shareholder capitalism, where the shareholders would actually be concerned about the bottom line profit of a corporation. But that's not what this is about. The people who are investing in these multinational corporations are not necessarily concerned about the bottom line. They already controlled 1/3 of the investable assets on the planet Earth. They want to use that power to direct those corporations along a certain path.
Yes. And they're using a term. I think I heard Trudeau use it the first time I ever heard it during the Freedom Convoy. It's reputational risk. McDonald's pulled out of Russia because of a reputational risk. And you're starting to hear this a lot. And it's like, oh, I see where this is going. I see what you people are doing. If the investors lead the corporations have the carrot that lead the public, because they are the ones who are experts at propaganda.
Yes. And unfortunately, the public has already demonstrated in spades over the course of the past century, let alone the past decades, that, yeah, I'm sure they can complain and they might not like it, but they will go along as the corporations start to change, because doing otherwise would require genuine work. And that is the road towards corporate serfdom, essentially. The United Nations and other organizations have been for some time trying to forward Agenda 21/Agenda 2030 through, okay, we're not going to do it through national governments trying to change constitutions and what have you. That's clearly not going to work. Let's do it at the local level. So we'll start these local groups. We'll get the mayors and the council members on board, and we'll start to pass these sort of local resolutions, and we'll start to change the structure that way so that it happens a piecemeal, but throughout a coordinated effort. And another way that they try to bring people on board with this is through the Delphi technique, where, come on, guys, we invite your public opinion, your public participation. We'll take all your comments, and then we'll come up with a plan for what we should do in the local area. And so you've already limited it down to people who actually care what's going on in their local area, which is maybe 1 in 100. And then you invite them in, and they can have a say, and here's your public comment space and time, and you can come talk to the council and blah, blah, blah. And then we'll come out with a report based on all of the feedback we've received. And then they come up with a report that they wrote before the whole process took place anyway, and do exactly what they were going to do. So this is how you control things, but it seems local and decentralized, but it's not really. And again, if people don't consciously understand what's happening or why they should do things this way rather than that way, then they can easily be led into the next trap.
The government has found a way around the Constitution by utilizing corporations. And no matter how much money government has dumped into corporations, creating this corporatocracy that we see around us, this public-private partnership that everybody seems to be aware of now that they weren't aware of 10 years ago, even though it still existed, they still call these companies private. And that's the problem. It's like, how much money does the government have to invest in a corporation before that corporation is no longer private? Because what they're talking about is like, we don't need to control the society if we control the corporations. If we control the companies and the politicians in their local regions, they can have whatever they want.
Exactly right. No, I think, again, this gives, once again, the lie to the idea that this is a democracy and you are the government and you decide. No, of course not. This is it's not simply a corporatocracy, but that's at least one way that power is wielded in our society. And so, yes, it doesn't matter which flavor of cola you're buying. Is it Pepsi or Coke? Or it doesn't matter. It's literally the same thing in the political context. So it speaks to our lack of ability to understand the system that has been erected around us, which we have been taught to believe is a democratic constitutional republic based on these principles and blah, 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 whatever indoctrination you get in whatever particular patch of the earth you were born into. Right. Whereas in reality, it doesn't function that way. That, yes, you're voting for Pepsi or Coke and take your pick and they're both going to screw you. It's just in what manner are they going to screw you? Right. So I think this is a recognition of that reality that ultimately, yeah, government / establishment, corporate, multi-global complex, it is the same thing. But you're exactly right. Part of the amazing trick that they do is just rebranding. So what we used to identify as fascism or corporatism, we now identify as public-private partnership. And it sounds, this is great. This is the new thing we're all on board with.
Yeah, and it gets even more complicated when you realize that the same families that are controlling the energy resources of the entire world are also controlling the central banking.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So the Rothschilds went from banking into oil, and Rockefellers went from oil into banking.
Right, and it's just
it always leads back to the same choke points for humanity, essentially.
Right, and so as they're shifting our dependence from fiat currency to central bank digital currencies, or from oil and petroleum into wind and solar, it's at their will. It doesn't depend on whether or not you think these oil.
You don't get a vote.
Exactly. That's not up to you.
No, that's exactly right.
Right.
What do I do about that?
Yeah.
And that's really the question. And if you're looking for a simple answer to that, I'm afraid I'm going to have to direct you to someone who will provide you a simple answer, and probably not a correct one. But I cannot think of a way from within this system to change the system in a way that's going to, we're going to convince those 250 people with 1/3 of the world's investable wealth to not go down this path. And they're not going to create these structures and these international bodies that interact with banks and institutional investors that, again, I have absolutely no control over. No, we're going to convince them to do that. I don't see how. The only thing that we have is our power, our labor, our time, our attention, our energy. That is the only thing that I have direct control over. And I can direct my power and energy and attention and resources into investing in the future that I want to bring about. And there's a million different things that we can think about and talk about with regards to that. But that's the only thing that I have any sort of control over when it comes to my life. I don't have control, unfortunately, over the investable wealth of the planet, which is increasingly being more and more tightly controlled. So all I know is the structure that has been created is a behemoth that is difficult to even comprehend in how overwhelmingly vast it is. The only thing we can do is turn away from that behemoth and do what we can for each other, because that behemoth isn't going to take care of us. Literally, the only control that we have is over what we're doing with our own resources, while we even have any sort of alternative to do with it. So we have to think of it in these terms. Every single time you're filling up that tank of gas at the gas station, you are supporting the companies that are doing this. Every time that you're buying one of these electronic slave devices, you are supporting the companies that are doing this. Every time you eat their fast food GMO crap, you are supporting the companies that are doing this. And every time you are trading in the monetary instruments that they give you, you have to understand that's all part of this system. So what can we do? We can start, to the extent that we can, stepping out of that bubble. And we are all part of this system. We're born into it. We're steeped into it. But until and unless we start finding and building up communities that support and understand what they are supporting, it's the creation of a parallel society. And that doesn't happen overnight. And it's not going to happen easily. And it's probably not going to happen ultimately without bloodshed. Yeah. There's no way that this happens peacefully and happily ever after.
Yeah.
ESG is now big business. It represents, by some estimations, something like $35 trillion worth of investments. And in the last 2 years, it's grown by 15%, and that rate of growth doesn't seem to be stopping.
Underneath this entire system are ratings that look a lot like the credit ratings of companies, but are based on completely unregulated data. And one company has come to completely dominate that business, and that's MSCI.
So even though a lot of people are talking about ESG, not many know what goes into making an ESG rating, for example. And that rating is what becomes the basis for decision-making for investors.
ESG ratings focuses in on what's significant to a company's bottom line.
What we found is that the foundation of this multi-trillion-dollar new cash machine for Wall Street is not at all what it appears to be, and that it's really almost exactly the opposite of what people think it is. I'm Cam Simpson. I'm a senior editor and reporter for investigations at Businessweek and Bloomberg. There are about 160 different companies that sell data and ratings that purport to rate companies on their environmental, social, and governance practices or factors. Because it's a completely unregulated business, because it's completely subjective, the ratings can land anywhere across the board. MSCI's rating system is built on scores, and they're converted into ratings that look like credit ratings. AAA, top of the line, CCC, bottom. By mimicking a credit rating, which is regulated, which is based on regulated data, MSCI has created kind of an aura of respectability, an aura of confidence for the investing world around these ratings.
I'm Akshat Rathi, and I'm a reporter with Bloomberg News. I write about all things climate. MSCI has been around for more than 2 decades, and it started its life as a company that would arrange stocks in an electronic index. As the company progressed, it found this demand for ESG metrics, that people were interested in not just ensuring that they were making profits from their portfolios, but that the companies within those portfolios were also aligning with society's goals. And so about 15 years ago, MSCI acquired a number of companies that gave it the ability to be able to create ESG ratings. MSCI has become the giant in the field. By one estimate, 40 cents on every dollar that is spent on ESG ratings is earned by MSCI. So what MSCI does with its ratings really matters to the entire industry.
So if you're a company, especially a bigger company that's included in the S&P 500, for example, your ESG rating can really significantly help you in the world. It can lower your cost of capital, which also can help you. And so they're really keen to have good ratings. And so when a company's rating goes up, MSCI produces an updated report that shows what the key factors were that led to the company moving up the ESG ratings ladder, moving up its score, moving up its rating. And so I started just with that, with a list of companies and upgrades, and to see how quickly and how high some of them could climb. We found half of the companies out of the 155 that we looked at got upgraded just for sitting still, because MSCI changed the way it weighted the score or changed the methodology, so their scores went up as a result.
Take McDonald's, for example. Its total emissions are those that match the entire country of Portugal or Hungary. And much of those emissions come from its use of beef. But when MSCI gave it an ESG rating upgrade in April 2021, it did that by reducing the weighting of emissions from a mere 5% to nothing, and instead replacing it with a new initiative that McDonald's had launched around recycling. Except that the recycling initiative came from installing bins in select locations in the UK and France. And when we looked at that, we found that within UK and France, there was either an upcoming regulation or a threat of a regulation which would have forced fast food companies like McDonald's and others to anyway install these recycling bins. And so McDonald's essentially got a ratings upgrade for doing the bare minimum that it should have done anyway, and for not being counted for all the emissions it was putting out into the atmosphere. And McDonald's is not a singular example. It's actually quite typical. When we look at the 150 upgrades, nearly half of the companies got that upgrade in their ESG rating without even fully disclosing their emissions.
We found the factors that were driving upgrades over and over again were for things like what MSCI calls corporate behavior. The other one that also was kind of surprising was data protection, and also the structure of boards deemed to be a factor in potentially having better outcomes for shareholders. Of the 155 rating upgrades that we looked at, we found only one where a reduction in carbon emissions was cited as a significant factor in the upgrade. The rating system and the ratings themselves create exactly the opposite of what many investors believe they're looking at. When they see a highly rated company, they think that company has strong environmental, social, and governance practices in terms of its impact on the world, its sustainability. But what they're actually measuring is exactly the opposite. Is the company sustainable? Is the value to shareholders sustainable? What's the impact of the world, climate change, water shortages, potentially on the company? It was a hard thing to get our heads around until we saw it all together in the data.
MSCI is the leading provider of investment tools in the world. And as such, our basic raw material are sophisticated models, big data, and advanced technology.
Henry Fernandez is the CEO and chairman of MSCI and has been since the founding of the company.
We asked him, do you think ordinary investors, retail investors, have any idea that the entire lens of the system is the impact of the world on the company and not the impact of the company on the world? And he said no, that they didn't have any idea. And in fact, he said he thought even investment managers who are putting together these funds didn't grasp it. They're not really concerned about the impact on the world, the investment managers. They're fiduciaries and their interest is in their fees.
Well, because if you think cow flatulence is even in the top 200 top issues for most Americans, you're Sandy Cortez. Get rid of fossil fuels? Yeah, what then? Well, starvation, poverty, societal collapse. Voters, it turns out, are not into any of those things. And so nothing that resembles the Green New Deal is going to pass the United States Congress in our lifetimes, provided this remains an actual democracy, which is to say, provided the public has anything to say about how they're governed. So that's a non-starter here. It's never going to happen by democratic means. But that doesn't mean it can't happen. It doesn't mean that ideologues can't impose the Green New Deal on weaker countries that are too poor to refuse it. And over the past several years, that's exactly what they've done. So the Green New Deal has actually taken effect around the world. So we don't have to guess about what would happen if it took effect here. We can know. Let's start with Ghana. Ghana's a pretty little country, peaceful place, actually, on the west coast of Africa. 3 years ago, Ghana was in great shape. It had one of the fastest growing economies in the world. In fact, it had so much energy over most of the last decade, it was exporting it to its neighbors in West Africa. Now, those energy exports from Ghana peaked in 2014. Why that year? Well, because the next year, the World Bank published this headline on its website, quote, World Bank approves largest ever guarantees for Ghana's energy transformation. Ooh, when they promise to transform your energy, slow down. But Ghana didn't slow down. They just kept going. And the World Bank promised to provide, and we're quoting, technical assistance for energy sector reforms and the drafting of a new renewable energy law. So in return for all this help, Ghana agreed to limit its carbon emissions. And then they entered the Paris Climate Agreement. Oh, how virtuous. What happened next? This is the part you don't read that much about. Last year, Ghana experienced a complete shutdown of its national power supply. Oh, no more electricity. No emissions because we have no electricity. And blackouts have continued since then. Just yesterday, a news source in Ghana reported that, quote, residents in parts of the Ashanti region who have been hit with power cuts are without water as well. Because it turns out you need electricity to provide water. Also to grow food. Now, this is not a small thing. The Ashanti region has millions of people living in it. They're all now living in the Stone Age. And it's not just the energy grid that's now compromised in Ghana. International observers say the country is now facing severe food shortages and hunger, starvation within a matter of months. Why is that? It's a fertile country, hardworking people. Well, now they're running out of fertilizer. Why? Well, because for years, Sandy Cortez's friends in the NGO community pushed Ghana toward less efficient, more expensive organic fertilizers. And the government of Ghana, because it's not a rich government, caved. Last year, according to Ghana's news service, Ghana's agricultural minister, quote, urged local farmers to adopt an organic agriculture system to reduce the impact of climate change. Oh, what happened then? Well, the good people of Ghana, while they feel good about their fight against climate change, are now starving. And in June, last month, police in Ghana used water and tear gas to attack hundreds of demonstrators in Accra, which is the capital of Ghana. Now, it's not just Ghana. The same thing just happened in Sri Lanka. In 2016, the World Economic Forum published an article by a Columbia professor called Joseph Stiglitz, one of the dumbest people on planet Earth, urging Ghana to transition to, quote, high productivity organic farming. Now, what does Stiglitz know about farming? Ever farmed? No. But he felt strongly that Sri Lanka should try a new kind of farming, and of course sold it to Sri Lankans as a pathway to prosperity. In 2015, the World Economic Forum published an article on its website entitled, and we're quoting, "This is how we will make Sri Lanka rich by 2025. You can search for that article, but it's gone now, along with the government of Sri Lanka. So they had an actual insurrection, not January 6th, not a guy in horns and a bearskin running around on mushrooms making weird noises. No, an actual insurrection, where they like come to your house and swim in your swimming pool, root through your sock drawer and make you leave. That's what they did to the people who run Sri Lanka, they being the public. The turning point came in 2021 when the president of Sri Lanka, acting on advice from the World Economic Forum, banned the use and importation of chemical fertilizers. Now, the problem was virtually every farm in Sri Lanka used those fertilizers to produce food, which it turns out people need every day in order to survive. As a result of that move, food prices in Sri Lanka nearly doubled. Millions more Sri Lankans now live in poverty, which is not a joke. And because the economy has collapsed, Sri Lanka now cannot afford fuel imports. So Sri Lankans are now waiting days for gasoline. Watch.
36-year-old Thuvan, an auto rickshaw driver, has spent 2 nights at this gas station in central Colombo. It's been an endless wait to refuel his 3-wheeler. Petrol pumps are all but dry across the city.
At every petrol station we go to, they tell us they have run out of gas.
With no fuel, Thuvan has been out of work. He leaves his rickshaw in the care of friends and heads home to meet family, where the situation is equally dire. There's been a crippling shortage of cooking gas across the island nation. Thuvan's wife Fatima has been cooking on a kerosene stove for the last 3 months.
I only have this 1 bottle of kerosene left. It'll finish after I heat the food tonight.
This is what the largest city in Sri Lanka, Colombo, looked like this week. what's so interesting is millions of people are now really suffering. The government just fell in Sri Lanka. And it's not just happening, by the way, in the third world. It's happening even in rich countries. The Netherlands, for example, which is a very rich country, the second biggest food exporter in the world, tried to do, for reasons that are not clear, but may have to do with Western guilt, the same thing that leaders in Sri Lanka tried to do. They just ordered farmers to cut virtually all of their nitrogen oxide emissions to, quote, save the environment. Now, doing that would shutter most farms in the Netherlands and destroy the country's food supply. And once again, that led to riots. So everything that's happened in Sri Lanka and Ghana and the Netherlands is happening at the behest, not simply of ideologues, but of some of the largest financial institutions in the world. They want more of this. It's why Ghana has achieved a near perfect ESG environmental impact score of 97.7. According to World Economic Research, Sri Lanka has an ESG score of 98.1. The Netherlands, 90.7. So the poorer you get, the more human suffering there is, the higher your ESG score. And that's important because companies will not invest unless you have a high ESG score. Interesting. So these countries have no choice. And that's why South Africa, for example, worked so hard to get an ESG score that now totals 91. Now, that effort began in 2015 when South Africa switched to renewables. Now, how did that work? Well, like everything in South Africa, no one in America really wants to know. Well, 7 years later, the Washington Post reports that South Africa regularly experiences, quote, rolling blackouts that last 8 hours or more, crippling economic activity and disrupting life in this nation of 60 million people. And that's true. Ask anyone who lives there. It's falling apart. It doesn't work. Also true in France. France is committed to renewable energy. How's that working? Well, France currently has an ESG environmental score of 92.6. Why? Because 10 years ago, France pledged to derive a quarter of all of its energy from renewables. In 2018, these policies led to riots. Remember the so-called yellow jackets? People didn't like it. If you cared about democracy, you would listen to them, but no one in charge actually does, so they don't. And things have gotten worse since then. This past June, the heads of 3 French energy companies called on the public to, quote, immediately reduce consumption of fuel, oil, electricity, and gas amid shortages and soaring prices. Oh, stop civilization. It doesn't work. That same month, France's president publicly begged Joe Biden to start producing more oil because the Saudis cannot make enough to supply Europe. Watch.
2 things. One, I'm at the maximum what he claims, and this is my complete commitment. Second, he told me, according to us, that the Saudis can increase a little bit, but 150 or a little bit more, and they don't have huge capacities. And this is before 6 months' time.
So only the Europeans have been dumb enough to embrace this. Unlike Ghana, they could afford not to, but they are anyway, out of some weird sense of collective guilt. So what's happening throughout Europe? In the UK, ESG score of 92.7, the National Infrastructure Commission has warned that as many as 6 million households could face power cuts this summer. Sound like the first world? No, it doesn't, but that's England now. In Germany, ESG score 90.2, the government is now rationing hot water due to an ongoing gas crisis. Officials in Hamburg, Germany's second largest city, just warned that, quote, warm water could only be made available at certain times of the day in an emergency. Now, it was just a few years ago that Germany's government laughed at warnings from Donald Trump that this would happen. It's on video. Oh, they are so stupid. You have no idea. Green energy is the future. Every place that's been tried has fallen apart. Every single one, with no exceptions. Albania, Kenya, Argentina, Peru, Ecuador, Panama, Libya, so on. But it's not just a problem there, it's becoming a problem here. So in the United States, our ESG score on environmental issues currently stands at 58. So at the very moment that Biden is sending our strategic petroleum reserve, which we own, he doesn't, to his son's business partners in China, he is vowing to end fossil fuels in this country and boost our ESG score. Watch.
Would there be any place for fossil fuels, including coal and fracking, in a Biden administration?
No, we would work it out. We would make sure it's eliminated and no more subsidies for either one of those. Any fossil fuel. No more subsidies for fossil fuel industry. No more drilling on federal lands. No more drilling, including offshore. No ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period. But I want you to look in my eyes. I guarantee you, we're going to end fossil fuel, and I am not going to cooperate with it, okay?
So let's just be really clear. fossil fuels aren't just not bad. Fossil fuels aren't just a net good. Fossil fuels are the only thing that stands between the United States becoming Ghana. Fossil fuels are the only thing that make the United States a rich country and not a poor country. We have the largest recoverable oil reserves in the world. If we can't tap those, we will be Ghana. We will be poor. But Joe Biden doesn't care. And like the leaders of every other country driven into the ground by green energy schemes thought up by morons like Sandy Cortez, he's taking no responsibility for the damage he has caused.
Look, we need more refining capacity. So then we ought to be able to work something out whereby they're able to increase refining capacity and still not give up on transitioning to renewable energy.
Problem is, he doesn't know anything about refining or extracting or how the grid works or anything about anything because he's never had a real job because he worked for the federal government since he was in his 20s. None of these people have any experience doing anything. Again, most of them can't drive a manual transmission. So to get a lecture on the power grid or energy from people who have no idea what it is a bit much. And the topic is too important to continue to listen to their nonsense as we become poorer. And by the way, as the rifts just beneath the surface in American society are exacerbated by that poverty. As GDP drops, societal tension rises. It's dangerous. Back off. And it's accelerating. In the past year, the United States has experienced blackouts in some of our biggest states. Why? Because they're relying more and more on renewables. Places like California and even Texas. Just yesterday, in order to avoid a blackout, the largest grid operator in the state of Texas begged residents to turn up their thermostats, no more AC for you, and asked them not to use any major appliances. Really, in Texas, which has the largest oil and gas reserves in the continental United States. What are they doing in Texas? But across the country, this is true. Orlando, Florida recently experimented with fertilizer bans to, quote, curb pollution. So the World Economic Forum wants a lot more of this. They just released a position paper calling for countries to, quote, agree to end the underpricing of fossil fuels, which is the principal factor preventing a clean energy transition. In other words, it's too cheap. It works too well. Gas needs to be higher, so you won't be able to use it. So you'll have to be poor. And they're saying this as we're watching countries around the world, we could give you more detail, you see the point, are collapsing and entering into a state of revolution because these morons tampered with their energy grids. But they don't care. They're going to continue doing it unless someone stops them until exactly the same thing happens here.
ESG scoring drives companies into sustainable development, aka technocracy. And of course, what better place to grab this story than technocracy.news. ESG stands for environmental, social, corporate governance. They dropped the C out of it because I guess ESG sounds better. Again, you always have to craft your good acronym as part of the propaganda. ESG stands for environmental, social, corporate governance and has been likened to a globalized social credit scoring system for business. If you have a high ESG score, it would be easy to qualify for credit, get the best deals with vendors, and participate in the not at all delayed global supply chain, I guess. Alas, if you don't have a high ESG score, you won't be in business long unless you change your behavior and knuckle under to the demands or, lie about your emissions like Volvo. How is ESG determined and who sets the rules and guidelines? First, ESG has nothing to do with the physical aspects of a company, capital, cash flow, profit. Rather, it concerns intangible factors such as how closely you, your vendors and customers adhere to sustainable development and climate change policies. According to Forbes, the story of ESG investing began in January 2004 when former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan wrote to over 50 CEOs of major financial institutions. Dear corporate overlords, we invite you to participate in a joint initiative under the auspices of the UN Global Compact and with the support of the International Finance Corporation and, of course, who can leave out the Swiss government. The goal of the initiative was to find ways to integrate ESG into capital markets. 1 year later, in 2005, an environmental policy wonk, Ivo Knopfel, wrote a major paper, Who Cares Wins? Connecting Financial Markets to a Changing World. Ha ha ha, very clever play on Who Dares Wins. The 58-page report contained recommendations by the financial industry to better integrate environmental, social, and governance issues in analysis, asset management, and securities brokerage. The corporate collaborators, which is the great name for them, far from real people like ordinary citizens, included big names you might suspect: World Bank Group, Morgan Stanley, HSBC, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, UBS, Mitsui Sumitomo Insurance, Citigroup, and others. And just like that, as they say, ESG was born. And down at the bottom of the article, James, next up will be ESG for individuals.
That's what this is. This is a social credit system for the international corporations, and that is important because it is going to direct ultimately trillions of dollars in capital. So BlackRock, in essence, sets the rules on ESG for companies. That is exactly what is happening. And the way to understand this is a global corporate mafia that is it's setting the rules, giving companies the deal they can't refuse, because if they refuse it, then their shareholders will be concerned and they won't want to invest in your company anymore. And who are these shareholders? Oh, in every single case, the primary shareholder in every major Western corporation these days is BlackRock and Vanguard. And who is that? That's the global corporate mafia. So they absolutely are setting their rules. And of course, it's all about saving the earth and making everything inclusive and happy, and it's also loving. But it is, of course, just the big stick that they are going to wield to against anyone who is not in their club. The club against those not in their club, if you will. Okay, so if people really want to really wrap their minds around the enormity of what is happening right now, because I guarantee you, if you are like 99.9% of people on the planet and concern yourself with things that actually matter, you will have no idea about the international regulatory framework space. But there are teams, scores of people right now in all sorts of international organizations working on setting the international regulatory framework. So in order to wrap your mind around that, I will point people to the ESG Insider podcast, which is an entire podcast put out by S&P Global that on a weekly or monthly basis is putting out conversations about ESG and how these regulatory frameworks are being formed and what they mean for businesses and how you can adopt and blah, blah, blah. And one of their recent episodes, for example, just gives you a real scope of how many different organizations and groups and corporations are right now working on this very issue. And why? Because there's so many different rules in so many different countries, and the EU has different regulations than the US. And what's a poor multinational to do? We need to harmonize all these. We need some sort of global standard. Oh, okay. Now here's the bodies that are working on the global standard. And that global standard is going to become hard-coded with whatever terms the global mafia want to dictate for whoever they're working with. And as I pointed out in Solutions Watch yesterday, it's not just about saving the earth and, your climate risk reporting or things like that. It's also about, well, now that Russia is the pariah of the world, how can we get companies to stop working with Russia in any way, shape, or form without having tyrannical top-down governmental policies? I know, we'll make it an ESG issue. If you have anything to do with Russia, if you have someone related to a Russian on your board of directors, that's it. Your ESG score is going down and no one will invest in you. This is a global mafia, and this is how they're doing it. So an incredibly important issue that not a lot of people are picking up on. I'm glad Patrick Wood's writing about it.
And you nailed it right there. Oh no, McDonald's and Starbucks are pausing their operations in Russia. Oh gosh, please don't leave us, poison merchants. That'd be really sad and terrible. Really interesting too, James, the video game mafia. Digitally removing Russia. When you go to play some sports ball, oh wait, Russia doesn't exist anymore. It's like that 1984 documentary. You won't even be able to ask questions about things.
For more on this, I want to bring in Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas. Senator Cotton recently wrote a letter to BlackRock raising questions about the company's ESG activities. And We want to thank him for joining us. And that's where I want to go with this conversation, Senator, because you have been outspoken and recently, as we said, just wrote this letter to BlackRock, effectively saying that their policies and their power and influence over companies around ESG are too much. What's the argument you're making, and then we can maybe dig into it?
Well, Andrew, what Larry Fink and BlackRock have done, in part through collusion with this climate action partnership, is essentially create a climate cartel. They are trying to suppress investment in the fossil fuel industry in America. And I know you have a lot of CEOs and investors who watch. I would just say this. If you're thinking about joining this climate cartel, you better think again and you better lawyer up. There's a reason why America's top law firms are already advising their clients to be wary here, because this is contributing to $5 a gallon gas. And when Republicans take charge in November, I'm going to make sure that the Congress is investigating these matters. This is almost certainly a breach of these firms' fiduciary duties, probably a civil violation of the antitrust laws, exposing them to triple damages, and very possibly a criminal violation. When we win back the White House in 2024 and the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission is no longer an ideological and partisan weapon against the oil and gas industry, some of these executives could be facing time in federal prison. Sure, there may be money to make in these industries because their Democratic pals in Congress are rewarding them with all kinds of tax breaks and government subsidies. But the simple fact is that these companies may be making money coming and going. A lot of these ESG funds have higher fees than other funds. Moreover, BlackRock and Larry Fink and other firms like his insist that they have not divested from fossil fuels. So for all we know, they are simply trying to increase the stock prices of companies like Exxon so they can make more money on that end of the scam as well.
I don't understand the scam of this. If in fact they are keeping their investments in fossil fuels, which they are, and by the way, they get criticized, of course, from the left for doing that, and in fact, they're now also putting money or encouraging companies to spend or to invest more in climate because they believe that that's where the future is from an investment perspective. What's wrong with that?
It's not simply that they're trying to invest in so-called green technology, Andrew. It's that they're trying to withhold capital, trying to deny access to the equity and the debt markets to these fossil fuel companies or companies that use fossil fuels. But you just said that they're not. Andrew, they're trying to cut. That's the stated goal of climate action, is to cut off access to the capital markets to these companies. That's the reason why we're pumping almost 1 million barrels fewer per day of oil in this country, even though demand has spiked. Normally, when demand spikes, you'd see oil and gas companies rushing into the oil patch trying to produce more. They're not. That's why they have record high profits. If Joe Biden and the Democrats don't like the profits of oil and gas companies, they should increase production, which will bring those profits down and bring down the price of gas at the pump. One reason you don't see that increased production is because oil and gas companies are being targeted by this climate cartel.